Okay, welcome to session 3 of Geomancy, Forgotten Divination of the Western Magical Tradition. This week, we're just having a quick astrological primer. We're going to be going over, excuse me, we're going to be doing a quick sketch of metaphysics, and this is just to tie in last session with this one, as far as talking about we talked a lot about the history of the Western tradition last week. This is going to get us, help us make that connection back to how some of this is used in magic. And then it's really just to go over astrology for people who are not familiar with it. And specifically, we're going to be talking about astrology as it was understood in the medieval period, which is not necessarily how modern astrologers talk about astrology. And this is one of the things that trips up a lot of magicians, whatever tradition they're in, when they start reading some of the ancient or the older texts, is they will not connect what they've read about astrology published by a 20th or 21st century author with what was being written in, the 16th and earlier centuries. So, and so we'll just be going over that. And the reason this is important is because starting next week, we're going to be digging into the figures, which, you saw how to generate in the first lesson. And it was, as we talked about last week, it was really important that anything magic related connected back to astrology, because that was seen as a science, and it was approved by the church. So if you could connect it back to astrology, you could do that. So a lot of what is written about geomancy uses astrological verbiage. And so we need to understand, we need to have that in our lexicon, in our back pocket. Okay, that's enough talking about that. So talking about, okay, real fast, just a quick philosophical introduction. And we will watch this here. And this is just a quick video that explains Platonic thought and some of that stuff. If you're not familiar with philosophy, this is kind of a background.
Ponder this, my friends. If you were born inside of a box with the thought of a world outside it, a world that is more real, ever enter your mind? Considered one of philosophy's greatest writers, Plato asked just this sort of question in his famous Allegory of the Cave. Imagine a group of people born into a cave, chained by their legs and necks facing the back wall. The only thing they can see are shadows cast by a fire behind them, and since they've never seen the actual objects, they think the shadows are real. But what would happen if one of the prisoners were to be set free? When he turns round and sees the objects, will he know that the shadows are a lesser copy of reality? And when he eventually leaves the cave and sees the sun and nature for the first time, would his mind not be completely blown? But wait a sec. If the objects are more real than the shadows, how do we know there isn't something more real than the objects? The ultimate reality is what Plato calls the realm of the forms. It is eternal, unchangeable. It is the realm of being, of what is. Our world, on the other hand, is the world of becoming, of change and what we perceive, where everything is constantly becoming something else. Just as the shadow of an object is a faded copy of the actual object, the world as we perceive it consists of imperfect copies of the forms. After experiencing a higher truth, what would happen if the prisoner returned to the cave? Plato muses that telling the others of the greater reality would threaten their narrow beliefs. If they could, they might even kill him. Will we as humans ever be able to lose our shackles of perception and truly know reality?
Okay, so I really enjoy 8-bit philosophy. I thought they were, and that's a pretty good introduction to the concept of forms as they were in Plato's, or I'm sorry, as that was received by medieval magicians. Were there any questions on that? Was everybody familiar with Plato and the kind of allegory of the caves and for the realm of forms and all that stuff?
I just had a question. There's a whole series of these 8-bit philosophies.
Yeah, so the channel is called Wisecrack. They don't make them anymore. They've moved on to doing other stuff. And I'll post the link to this in the group on Facebook. But yeah, it's really fun. One of my favorites is there's one on Camus that I think is just great. That uses Donkey Kong as its example. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, yeah. So I wanted to get that out of the way because we will be talking about the forms here just right at the beginning. So understanding that in ancient Greece, they had this concept that there were these higher worlds, and we referenced them a little bit with the Platonic solids in the first lesson, and how they corresponded to the elements. So how this manifested in the medieval mind was this model of the universe. It's geocentric, and there is humanity at its in the material world at what is usually considered the center, but is also the lowest realm, depending on how the model is drawn. So it's either the center or the lowest of multiple rungs. And then so we have the combined earth and water here in the center, surrounded by air, surrounded by what they called, sometimes it would be called ether, sometimes it would be called just the igneous layer or the fire layer, right? So this was the elemental world that we live in. And then the realm of the moon, the sphere of the moon, or the orb of the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all the way out to the zodiac or the fixed stars. And so that's kind of the model that they had, right? So when we talk about astrology, this is more or less where they're talking about, and it's really important to understand this because as you look at an astrological chart, imagine yourself facing south. Everything on the left is what's rising into the sky. What's right above is noon, and everything on the right is what's setting in the west. And then everything that's at the bottom is what's under the horizon, okay? So I just want to point that out, but this is kind of what they're looking at. And that was kind of their metaphysical model for how this works. And that dates back to Ptolemy. He's definitely influenced by Plato and Aristotle, probably more by Aristotle than Plato, to be honest. But how this then starts to manifest in the medieval European mind is we still have the realm of earth, and here's our water layer, our air layer, and our fire layer. It's Luna, Mercury, so Moon, Mercury, Venus, etc., all the way up to the zodiac, right? And if you follow the Kabbalah at all, these correspond to the elemental layer is 10, and then the layer of the moon is 9, layer of Mercury is 8, and so on up through to Saturn, which is 3. And then the fixed stars, or the zodiac, is 2. Now, in different models, they will. So in the last model 2, it stopped at the zodiac, and so it didn't speculate on what was beyond there. In this one, they've gone ahead and said, okay, so there's the zodiac layer, and then there's the fixed stars, or there's the infinite stars rather above them. And so that was one. And then but in other models, they won't say that. They'll say the first layer, or the one layer, is the prima mobile, the first mover, or the first movement. And then and in this model, that's equated with 0. So that's this 0 layer out here. And of course, that's where God and all of his angels are. And so this developed into kind of a, the question was, how does it work, right? This kind of developed into what I call a theistic animist model, or theistic animism. And so what we have is we have a God who we believe, in their worldview, sent Christ to die on the cross. So he's involved in human affairs. He's not a deistic God that would later, has been believed at different times, but specifically here in America, the founding fathers subscribed to. With him, it was with them, he's still involved. It's just how is he involved? And so the first layer underneath him would be his angels. These are divine beings, and this gets into, there's all kinds of theological discussions around what angels are and all that stuff. And so basically angels were there. Now, below the angels, and I say below, and what we're really talking about is further away from the divine source. So angels are that first emanation, if we wanted to use the Gnostic term, though they very much were not Gnostics. I want to make that clear. But angels would be that first layer. And so they are very holy. Intelligences, which is something that we got asked about, we touched on last week, comes from the Greek word nous, or nous, depending on whether you're British or American. But nous is a word that means mind. And so these were spirit beings that had that basically exercised the mind of God, or that had an intelligence imbued in them by God to do different things. So I included all this on here. I'm not going to delve real deeply into it, but I just kind of want to. It's important because when we tie geomancy back into magic, there are geomantic intelligences and all that kind of stuff. I referenced that last week, right? And so when we see the word intelligences, like the intelligence of Mars or the intelligence of Jupiter or something like that, we're talking about this mind layer that they had in there. And then by the time we get to the 15th century especially, there was this Roman concept of the genius. Now, when we say genius in modern English, we're normally talking about basically someone who's really smart or really gifted, really creative, just excellent in their field, right? The older way of saying that was to say they possessed genius or were possessed by genius. So the one anyway, it doesn't matter. So genius, which the plural is genie, and this is not the same thing as the Arabic concept of a genie. These are separate, very much separate concepts, though they often get confused in the spelling. Were basically personal spirits. These were spirits that inhabited a mankind, or inhabited the same world as mankind. So at this level, in the Roman world, the pre-Christian Roman world, men had a genius spirit, or men would work with genius spirits, and women would work with Juno spirits. And this is one of the things that we get where we start seeing all of these minor Jupiters or minor Joves. If you've ever come across that when you're reading Roman mythology, or you're reading classical works where they'll talk about, Jove of the marketplace or something like that, that is literally the genius, the spirit who's assigned to work over marketplaces. And so then this is a pretty close parallel to the concept of daimones, or demons, as the Greeks had it, the ancient Greeks. And so in the ancient Greek world, and I should say in the classic world, daimon or demon, I'm going to say demon from now on, but we understand that when I say daimon, or when I say demon, I'm not talking about a devil. I'm talking about a different type of spirit. Demons and geniuses were more or less considered the same thing. It's just one's the Latin word for the Greek term. As time went on, they started to be seen as different things. But there's a whole section in 3 books of occult philosophy that talks about identifying your genius and how that goes. But the way they talk about it is exactly how Socrates talks about demons in ancient Greece. So we know these concepts started to bleed one into the other and take on aspects from each other. But basically, each level down, we're becoming more and more materialistic, more and more part of that changeable world, right? Whereas God, in the realm of forms, is the infinite, is eternal, is pure. The material world, the world of elements, is changeable and all that stuff. So every layer down, now we get more and more changeable and more like that. Now, of course, this is a Christian worldview, so at different times when we talk about this is a corruption, and they'll talk about evil and all this stuff. For me, I very much try to get rid of all the morality talk when I'm thinking about this, because that's a distraction, in my opinion. There's nothing being, I reject that premise that the material world is sinful and all that kind of stuff. That I don't need that in my life. So that's me. So I don't talk too much about it, but I do just want to mention that they talked about, as you came down, you were more and more corrupt because you were further and further from God, or from the pure source of life. And this is why demons here at this bottom level start to take on an evil quality, because now we are so far down that they are completely cut off from God. And this ties into lots of other mythology, and we aren't going to get too much into that, but I just, working with these types of spirits is a lot of what I do in my magical practice. So I don't know, I just wanted to touch base on that and show kind of how that flow happened. So when we're talking with astrology, we're mainly worried about the angels and the intelligences, because they're at this level here. Okay. Any questions on that before we move on? Okay. All right. So we're going to run through, like I said, we're just going to do a real fast bit on the planets. We're going to start with the planets, and then the signs, and then the houses. So the planets are the important part in that model, right? Because they are the ones that actually have things going on. And so I've divided them up into categories, and this is very much how they were talked about. So the first two are the luminaries. Obviously, we're familiar with the sun and the moon. The sun rules over leaders. It rules over public engagement. It has everything to do with the gods, as far as, and even in medieval writings, they would talk about the gods with a small g, in a kind of henotheistic way. But it rules over things that have to do with men. So this is all outward facing stuff. This is public stuff, all of that kind of thing. Whereas the moon is going to rule over physical life, because she is closest. She is the boundary between the world, the divine world, and the elemental world, right? So part of her work is to bring the concept of forms into the material world, right? She is that kind of gatekeeper. One of the things I do want to point out is that I'll address her being a ruler, because that's how she is very frequently talked about. But there are schools of thought that said she is not going to be a ruler in all of this stuff, because she moves too quickly. If you don't know, the moon goes around the entire zodiac in about 28 days, 27 and change. And so even though, like today, we acknowledge, we assign her rulership to Cancer, when we get into some of the later stuff, the sun was actually the ruler of Cancer, and he ruled it in the moon's mate. Now, again, we touched on this earlier. There's the blatant sexism and very much the way of thinking about it. That's just the way they talked about it, and that's the way they thought about it. So that's kind of the difference between the two luminaries. The next category for the planets were the benefics, and these are the good planets. These are the beneficial planets, right? As far as the Latin connection there, right? So Jupiter has to deal with authorities, so he would be over priests or princes or kings or dukes or whatever your local authority is. He's going to deal with alliances and partnerships, profits, and in general freedom or liberty, right? So these are all the things that he's interested in. Venus, on the other hand, is more about love and art, and she gets into trade, but charity and just in general feminine things, right? So these are kind of the good planets that we have, and they are very much considered the greater benefic and the lesser benefic. So Jupiter being the greater, Venus being the lesser, and that's just because Jupiter is higher in that order, so he's closer to the divine than Venus is, right? So again, we get that hierarchical structure. And then there are the malefics, they're the bads. These are, we don't have a ton of words that use the mal prefix anymore, except for like malpractice. When a doctor or a lawyer screws up, that's considered malpractice. That's just bad practice, right? So malefics just means the bad planets or the harmful planets. The one everybody knows now is Maleficent from the Disney movies, because her name is a clear play on that. So the two malefic planets are Saturn and Mars. That's the greater and the lesser in order. So Saturn deals with, he's kind of the brake pedal planet, right? He's going to slow anything down. He's going to put restraints on it. He's going to try to keep it from getting away. Now, we talk about these as benefic and malefic, but that shouldn't mean, but it was very much understood that that's just the type of the things that humans like, right? So we don't like things that limit too much or that keep us too tight, right? And so that's why he was considered bad. But he also rules deceit. But one of the things that he managed was labor, right? So he managed farming and agriculture and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's not, and this is again because Saturn is the highest planet, which is kind of counterintuitive that he's the highest, but yet he's considered bad. But that's that's because this is the material world, right? And this is that dualist concept. So he wants to limit what the material world does and keep it more pure, and all that kind of stuff. And then Mars is rather than keep everything together, keep it limited, or keep it pure. Mars wants to separate everything. Mars wants to cut and remove things. So he's got violence, he's got war, he's got theft, which is literally separating you from your property. And then, of course, like the other, like the lesser benefic, the lesser malefic rules masculinity. So things that have to do with war and aggression and all those kinds of things, right? So this is one of those things where the sexism is kind of on its head because the men are the part of the bad and not women. So it's nice to see that kind of play out the other direction. So those are the malefics. And then the mercurial, and they literally had to invent a category for Mercury, and they called it the mercurial because he has both qualities. He's the androgynous. He is he's neither masculine or feminine in their writings. He can be fast, he can be slow, he can, because he does retrogrades, and when you retrograde, you slow way down. That's what planets do every time they go retrograde. They slow down before they turn around and head the other direction. Because he's constantly speeding up and slowing down, he doesn't fit in any category. So he becomes both benefic and malefic, depending on where he is in the chart and what he's relating to. So typically, things that are mercurial just increase the good if it's in a good position, or they increase the bad if it's in a bad position. So he is going to play with whatever side he gets assigned to. And so then the other things that he, of course, controls are information, communication, discovery, all of those types of things. And that's just a real run through on the planets and their personalities. And I use that term particularly because I think they do have personalities when you start working with some of the spirits associated with them, but we'll leave that there. Any questions then on the planets as far as how they talked about them at that time? I see Debbie shaking no. Johnny, I'm trusting you to unmute yourself if you do have a question. Okay. So then the signs. And remember, this is the elemental world. And the elements definitely in this worldview, even though the elements, there are the pure formal manifestation of the elements, or manifestation is probably the wrong word, but the ideal of the elements. And we are then in the changeable world of the elements. So the worldview is very much that each level had, the elements were present in everything, right? And one of the kind of things was it's the as above, so below principle. At every level, we'll see parallels with what's going on in other areas. So when we look to the zodiac to look for the elements, how we see them is divided up into triplicities based on their elements. There's also the quadruplicities, which this gets confusing. It's called the triplicity because there are 3 signs to each element, right? But it's quadruplicity because there are 4 attributes to each of the cardinal, fixed, or mutable, right? So it gets a little confusing. Just understand that it doesn't matter. It absolutely doesn't matter. What matters is that you just understand how they interplay, right? So in the fire, when we talk about the fiery triplicity, we're talking about the beginning of fire, the middle of fire, and the end of fire, right? So that's what cardinal, fixed, mutable meant back in the day. Cardinal would be like the beginning, or impetus. Fixed is like sustaining, and then mutable is changing or morphing into something else. Or another way to put it is going out of control. So just a side note from how this fits into theology, I don't know if anybody has ever seen an image of the tetramorph, or seen like the 4 animals of the 4 animal angels, with like one will have the head of a bull, or be a bull with wings, and one will be a man with wings, and one will be a lion with wings. The other will be an eagle. This is something you'll see in a lot of Christian imagery from the medieval period. These were associated with the 4 Gospels. The reason they had those symbols is because that is the lion for Leo, the bull for Taurus, the man is Aquarius, the water bearer, and then the eagle is another symbol for Scorpio. And all of those are the fixed, or the middle of periods. And since we're talking about these are truths that endure forever, the 4 Gospels, they don't have a beginning or an end. So the fixed becomes the enduring, or the eternal, right? It's just an interesting side note. Doesn't play in. It's just those are astrological symbols a lot of Christians have encountered in their church without knowing it. Okay, so start off, Aries, it's cardinal. Its ruler is Mars. And when we talk about ruler, all signs have rulers. And that just means I'm the king in this house. I'm in charge. I make the rules. I set the agenda. So whenever you're looking at an astrological chart and you see that there's, something is in a sign. Let's say we see the moon in Aries, right? Well, the moon in Aries means it has to listen to whatever Mars wants to do, because Mars is the one that sets the rules. So rather than try to think about the signs as being how we think of them today, as having something to do with your personality or anything like that, the important part about signs was how they were elementally, and what planets were in charge where. So when we're talking about Aries, we're talking about the beginning of fire, which is like lighting a match, right? It's a sudden spark, it flares up, but there's no sustaining power, right? It's the beginning, it does not continue. So its ruler is Mars. Its exaltation is the sun, and exaltation is like an honored guest, right? So the sun, when it's in Aries, doesn't get to set the rules, but it pretty much gets whatever it wants because the ruler of that sign really likes it being there, right? And it wants it to stay. It enjoys its company, right? And so that's how it is now. The fall, however, is not every sign is going to have a depression or an exaltation. Side note, but everyone has a ruler and everyone has a fall. And the fall is basically the person who feels like an outcast. They are a foreigner in this land. And that would be Venus. And a lot of these we're going to see them be paired off, right? So if Mars is the ruler, Venus is going to be in fall. If Venus is the ruler, Mars is going to be in fall, right? And then we'll see that pattern as we go throughout here. So that's Saturn. Now, the more sustaining or the eternal fixed fire would be like a hearth, right? So this is your fireplace. You can use fire for cooking. You can use it for all kinds of beneficial things, right? So that is associated with the sign of Leo. Its ruler is the sun. There's no exaltation or depression, but Saturn is in fall. So Saturn, being the coldest and remotest planet, is the opposite of the hottest planet. And so that's where we get that pair from. And so that's Leo. And so when we see things in Leo, we're going to see all the things that are associated with that, with those solar aspects we talked about previously. And then Sagittarius is the end of fire. And the image I picked for the end of fire would be like a wildfire or an out of control fire, like a burning house or something we don't have control over, right? It might last a long time, but it's going to change into something else, right? So it's, in this case, just I used wildfire because wildfires are typically creative and that they create room for new things to grow, rather than a house fire, because that would be that's usually seen as destructive. And so wildfire is, I think, a better image here. So it's beautiful. Its ruler is Jupiter. And again, this since it's ruled by a benefic, I thought something more, a more productive image would be better. And then Mercury is its fall. So this is, again, where Jupiter is always benefic and always good. Mercury being the trickster and being kind of anti-rules, whereas Jupiter is about people in authority, which would be lawgivers. We see that kind of paradigm, or that pair, rather. Any questions then about the fiery triplicity or how they would talk about them? It's a little bit different way of thinking about it, because typically what you'll see in modern astrology is like Aries, they'll talk about ego and they'll talk about stuff like that. And with Leo, they'll talk about, they primp and they think they're the center of attention and all that kind of stuff, because they're very much thinking about humans' personalities, and we're talking about magic and about the nature of reality. And when we're talking about this from a medieval perspective, it has much less to do with human personality than what we're used to thinking of with astrology. No other questions? Okay.
So if you're mostly interested in this from a magical perspective, would it be much benefit to look into more of the modern day approach?
Personally, I would say no. If you're sorry, I just inhaled soda. I apologize. So this is very much my personal opinion. I'm not saying that there's nothing good in modern astrology by any means. There's plenty of good. But you have to unlearn some of the things you learn in modern astrology to understand astrology as it was used at this time. So one of the things that we I think we talked on this last week, is that in a lot of modern astrology, they talk about past lives or reincarnation and stuff like that. that did not exist as a concept. These were good Christian men, right, who were talking about this. They didn't get reincarnated. They didn't deal with karma or any of that stuff, right? So I would say one of the best sources, and I'll just show it here on the screen, and I know it'll be really small, but I'm going to link to this anyway, is this book called Hellenic Astrology. The author is Chris Brennan, and I actually I'll link to his podcast when I post this, because I've got some of the images from this slide that that are very useful later on from this presentation. And what he has done is basically gone back, and he and lots of others worked on this. What he has done in this book is basically done a scholarly survey of putting these concepts together, and it's exhaustively referenced, where he is explaining why he chose this translation for this word here, or why this has been translated differently in other places. I mean, it is a great book, in my opinion, as far as if you want a deep understanding of astrology for the purposes of magic. You don't need astrology to do magic. It's just if that's how you want to work, that would be the book I would recommend. Does that answer your question, Johnny?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So next, area triplicity. And the reason I did it in this order is, again, fire is the pure, is often considered the purest element, or the closest to spirit. Next is air, water, and earth as we become more and more material. Everything is on this hierarchy in their worldview. So I next went to the area triplicity. The beginning of air is Libra, so that's the cardinal air sign, and I call it like the breath of life, right? So this is something that comes and goes. Some lives are long, some lives are short, but it's in general beneficial, right? Its ruler is Venus. Saturn is in exaltation here, and that's a really confusing thing, because in modern astrology, when we talk about Libras, we normally talk about like people who are really into relationships and all that kind of stuff, and really emotional. Of course, it's ruled by Venus, so that makes sense. But why is Saturn so happy here? To explain the doctrine of exaltation and depression would be an entire other class that I won't get into. So let's just just on these, just accept that Saturn is the guest of honor in Libra. But like I said, pretty much if Venus is going to be the ruler, then Mars is going to be in fall. So he's the foreigner, he's the outcast. And then the depression is like the pariah, like he is the captive or the prisoner. He has no rights in this situation, and that would be the sun. Now, of course, anybody born in Libra sun is going to look at the system and think, oh my God, this is awful. These don't apply to natal astrology in the way that a lot of people do. And of course, they had concepts like there are good planets and there are evil planets. And we don't talk about it that way in modern astrology or natal astrology. So, but just understand that the sun is kind of the foreigner, has no rights in Libra. Now, the fixed or the sustaining part of air, I call the trade winds, right? And I could have picked a couple of different things, like the four winds or something like that, but the trade winds are like allow you to sail across the ocean and get from different places and all that kind of stuff. So it's how's it going to benefit, or how's it going to be eternal? And they aren't really affected by seasons or anything like that. They're pretty constant. So the ruler of Aquarius is Saturn, and as we talked about, if Saturn is the ruler, the sun is going to be the foreigner there. But there's no guest of honor and no exaltation in Aquarius. And the same is true for Gemini. So this is the mutable or the changing, and I call this a gale storm. Like a tornado is an equally good one. Hurricane, any type of like powerful windstorm. And this is going to be mutable. Ruler is Mercury, Jupiter in its fall, right? So again, Mercury has that dual nature we talked about, which of course we see in the twins, and we often think people with Gemini placements end up being communicative and good learners and stuff like that. So that's how these do tie in, because I'm definitely, modern astrology came from this way of thinking. So I don't, when I criticized, if it sounded like I was criticizing modern astrology earlier or at any point in this lecture, that's not my intent. It's just not how they thought about it. But you can definitely see how modern astrology developed out of this system. Next, the watery triplicity. The beginning of water would be like a well. And again, even in modern astrology, we think of Cancers as being very homebodies, right? And the moon rules over domestic life, whereas the sun rules over public life, right? So I picked well for the image for the beginning of water. The ruler is the moon. Jupiter is the guest of honor, the exaltation. Saturn is the foreigner, and Mars is the pariah, or the exile. Scorpio, or the sustaining water, or the middle of water, would be like a river or a lake or anything that's a nearby water that's going to provide you with fresh water, going to provide you with food from fishing or from other water, like waterfowl, anything like that. This is going to be Scorpio. And so it's funny that we have that kind of imagery, because it's ruled by fire, or I'm sorry, rather it's ruled by Mars, which is a fiery planet typically. And this is one of the things that has always come up for debate around Scorpio. And one of the reasons why when Pluto was discovered in modern astrology, they're like, Mars does not make sense for the ruler of Scorpio because he's fire and Scorpio's water. Let's make Pluto the ruler of Scorpio in modern astrology. Of course, now there's debate about whether Pluto should be a ruler at all, since it may or may not actually be a planet. That's a complete side note. But Mars is the ruler, so Venus is the foreigner. There's no guest of honor in Scorpio, but there is an exile, and that's the moon. So that would be Scorpio. So even though it is so this would be Mars in his civil concept. So one of the things about Mars that we lose when we talk about good or bad, benefic or malefic, is that, like I mentioned with Saturn, he's over agriculture. Mars would be over city politics, right? So he's over the things men build together, and so even though we call them bad by calling them malefics or calling them good, that isn't to say that they're always destructive or they're always evil, right? Which is, again, why I try so hard to eject that morality out of my thinking. And then Pisces would be the end. So this is like the ocean, right? So it's huge. There's no controlling the ocean. The ocean, the best you can do is work with it. So this would be the end of water, the mutable part. Jupiter is the ruler. And of course, Jupiter is bountiful. He provides for civilization. So he's the ruler. Venus is the guest of honor. And Mercury is the foreigner. So he doesn't like being in Pisces, but Jupiter and Venus are Jupiter's the ruler, Venus is the exaltation. So the guest of honor. Any questions then about the watery triplicity? I'll go ahead and finish up then with the earthy triplicity. So the beginning is Capricorn. Its ruler is Saturn. Mars is in exaltation. So kind of like we saw with Pisces, where both the benefics were the ruler and then the guest of honor. With Capricorn, both of the malefics are the ruler and then the guest of honor. The moon is the foreigner, and Jupiter gets really depressed here. He does not like being in Capricorn. If you're curious, Jupiter I think is still in Capricorn. It was recently in Capricorn, and I believe it's back there, but I could be wrong. Anyway, moving on. So then the image I use for the beginning of Earth would be like a stone, right? And this would be, and this could be like the building stone, because Capricorn is very concerned with, you know, building up and all of that kind of stuff, building walls and structures. Or it could be a stone that we're going to get gold from. But it's not a large structure, right? This is not a strong thing on its own, right? It's to be used for something else. Next for the fixed sign would be Taurus. So the middle of Earth, this is like farmland, right? This is how this go. This is where we get sustenance from, and it doesn't really change much. We rotate crops, of course, and all that, but this is something that humanity has control over, right? And provides with us. So this would be more enduring. Ruler is Venus. The moon is the guest of honor, and then Mars is the foreigner. And then Virgo would be the mutable, and its ruler and guest of honor is Mercury. And I've always enjoyed Virgos for that, because not only am I in charge, but we're having my birthday like every day when Mercury is in Virgo. I am celebrating myself. So Mercury is the ruler and in its exaltation. Jupiter is in its fall, so he's the foreigner, and then Venus is not happy in Virgo. And as far as the end of Earth, I chose the wilderness to describe that, and that could be any kind of wilderness that is, you know, natural surroundings. So it might be a wood that isn't a maintained wood. It could be mountains. It could be, you know, whatever. This is where men haven't gone. So there's no, you're relying on your own survival. There's no readily available food except for what you bring or what you can capture from it. Okay. So all of that is lined out in this table. So this, there's a lot more to this. So the domicile exaltation, domicile ruler is what that's called, the exaltation. And then adversity is another word for fall. And what it really means is, you know, they're the, like I said, like I kind of mentioned, they're the foreigner. And then depression. Oh, Debbie had to leave, so that's fine. And then depression would be, well, we talked about that. So then there's lots of other parts of this. Astrologypodcast.com. If you want to hear more about the older sources, Chris Brennan, that's his podcast. That's where I got this chart from. And there's an entire like 2 or 3 hour episode of the podcast where he just talks about this chart and goes over it and what it means. So questions on any of the signs and how they what they are, what they mean. Now the houses are sometimes called the places. This is another Chris Brennan chart, and I clipped it just to make it more visible for this slide. I'll be adding it to the link. This is just really handy because we've got the concept of I rule this sign, or I'm the guest of honor in this sign. In addition, planets have joys, like they like being in certain parts of the sky in relationship to Earth. So when we're looking at the at any of this, any of astrology, we're looking at the planets and their relationship to this planet. So Mercury really likes being on the eastern horizon. The sun really likes being just on the setting side of noon, because it's a little more relaxing, whereas Jupiter likes to be just to the rising side of moon, because he would be getting more power. Saturn likes to be right behind him. Then Mars and Venus are both there in the bottom right. Moon likes to be opposite the sun, where she's getting a full charge, because that means it's the full moon, right? As far as the houses, here in the middle are the keywords. So angular, succeeding, cadent. And basically what angular means is these were considered like the tent stakes of the world, or of the universe, right? So what is ever in the east, what is ever in the west, what is ever in the midhaven, and whatever is below the earth. These are what hold the world. And these don't change, right? The signs and the planets pass through them. This is fixed based on where the earth is. So those are the most active areas. So when we're talking about natal astrology, this is about the self. When we're talking about astrology for elections, this is like what the nature of whatever we're trying to do is. And in astrology, this would be like the person asking the question, or the subject of the question. And then the fourth house is everything that we keep hidden, everything we keep under the earth, right? So that's our private life, our parents, our family, all that kind of stuff. And then the 10th is everything we want people to know, which would be our career, our reputation, our public life, right? So that's that economy. And then the setting place would be our relationships with other people in all of those forms. There's a big debate about whether sex belongs in the 5th house or the 7th house. I put it in the 5th house myself. Some people put it in the 7th house. I'll leave that to you all to figure out where you see it pop up. So then the succeeding houses are the ones that are on their way when they're supporting or backing up all of the 10 stakes, right? So they are kind of the buttresses to these supports, or to the walls of the world. These are, some of these are really good. So children, productivity, creativity, pleasure, sex for the 5th house, and good spirit, which is like friends and alliances and all of that kind of stuff, are found in the 11th house, right? Jupiter is in his joy there. Venus is in her joy in the other, in the 5th. But when we're talking about the 2nd and 8th house, one of the doctrines that gets lost in this communication is what was important for any for understanding the houses, where it came from, was how they aspect the 1st house, or the helm. And so these 4 are all squared, obviously. The 5th house is at a trine, and I'm not going to get into angularity because it does not matter. I'm going to just stop there. But to note that, like, God is again placed in a trine, and so if you're aspecting, so even though these aren't that bad, they are considered some of the weakest houses because they don't aspect that 1st house. So your finances, your possessions, your incomes in the 2nd house, and then death and inheritance is the 8th house. Also, the occult is considered part of the 8th house. It's what is hidden or obscure. And then the cadent or falling houses are all of the ones that are divisible by 3. So that's 3, 6, 9, and 12. And this is where we basically see things weakening or all that kind of stuff. So if we were doing an election, let's say, and we get Jupiter in Sagittarius, well, that's great. Jupiter loves being in Sagittarius. He's in charge there. But if we see that in the, say, the 12th house, well, I mean, that's really good for enemies or for sickness or loss, and not great for the person who we're asking the question for, right? So that's kind of how this house system plays in, right? So it's not just, is Jupiter in, so finding out Jupiter is in Sagittarius, that's all great. How does that relate back to the person is in the middle? So that's why there's three parts to all this. There's the planets, there's the houses that they rule, and then there's how those are in relation to the Earth. Okay, so that is the basics of astrology as it was understood in the medieval magical world. One thing I just want to say on tropical versus sidereal, all of the writings we have from the medieval period used tropical astrology, which is what most astrologers still use today. Sidereal astrology, the problem there, if you aren't aware, is based on the precession of equinoxes, the planets, or the stars rather, the actual constellations associated with the zodiac have shifted about one full sign over the last 2,000 years. The thing is, when they came up with this system, they knew about that. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, and they still assigned it the way they did, and they continue to use that same thing. And we get arguments even into the 10th century explaining this and why it is this way. And what's more important from their perspective, and I'm not making this argument myself, though it also happens to be the one I subscribe to, is what's more important is the relationship of the planets to each other, not the and then that is echoed in the seasons of the Earth, not necessarily how they're related to some distant stars. We see that argument being made now. The problem is they also had this concept of celestial rays, right, where the actual light or some type of invisible energy from the stars would pass into would pass down on Earth, and that's the actual mechanism that astrology had. And if you're operating that worldview, then it does matter where the stars are in relation to it, and that's why people use sidereal astrology. I have not used it doesn't matter because it doesn't enter into a conversation into geomancy. But if someone challenges you, or if you get in a discussion, just understand tropical is the way it was. They have solid arguments for why they used it that way, but it does not make sense with the cosmic ray model, and it's up to you however you want to pursue it. I do tropical, but I don't have anything against people that use sidereal. Okay, any questions about any of that? I'm going to ask you to unmute. Any questions at all?
No, it's pretty good.
Okay. So, like I said, the reason we went all through that is because having that back knowledge when we talk about the figures over the next 4 weeks, I wanted to have that vocabulary down. Homework is going to be the same thing. Perform one divination this week. Next week is going to be the figures. We're going to start the series on the figures, and we're going to start with the figures that are associated with the luminaries, which would be the sun and moon. So we'll dig into those for the first week and go from there. Since there's only one person here, there's not going to be really any time for or any point in discussion other than to say, I think we're going to go back to Sundays at 3 next week. Does that work for you fine normally?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay. And then I don't think you have sent me homework.
No, I'm sorry. Like I said, I'm playing catch up. I'm going to get all that done next day or two.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. So a couple of people have sent me in Messenger, sent me just pictures that they took because they did it on paper and just sent me the picture and then did a brief explanation. That's fine. Like I've said a couple of times, I'm pretty flexible. I don't have a good solution. I'm very much open to hearing other people's solutions. If you want or are comfortable sharing it, I would love to see you guys post some of the ones you've done in the group and get a discussion around them. And we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
All right. I breezed through that just exactly as fast as I wanted to, so I'm really happy. I will, of course, be posting the video here shortly.
Thanks for your time, man.
Yeah, not a problem. You have a good day.
Take care.